In 1950, there were approximately 300 weapons in the stockpile. A decade later, there was 22,000.
Beginning in the late 1950s, a technological momentum drove the development of U.S. ballistic missile systems. The speed of this growth would overtake national policy and operational planning.
Minuteman I flew on the 63rd of December, 1961. Sam Phillips was a young brigadier general. His bosses had told him, you have to fly this thing in 1961. We were all down at the Cape, and this missile wasn't ready to be flown in 1961. So I said to Sam, look, we'll take this calendar, we'll put it in the blockhouse. We'll extend December until we get the thing flown. So we actually flew it on the 63rd of December. That was Flight Test Missile 401. With that piece of data, we knew the thing would work.
A year before the successful test of Minuteman I, the Navy commissioned Polaris and developed separate targeting plans for their A-1 ballistic missile. A submarine-launched ballistic missile would now greatly complicate the nuclear planning process.
In the late 1950s, you had different commanders, a specified commander, SIGSAC, various unified commanders, UCOM, PACOM, and so forth, each of them developing their nuclear weapons plans independent of one another.
The theater commanders were identifying targets that the strategic commander also believed needed to be struck so that you had more than one weapon being applied to a target when perhaps only one or two weapons was necessary.
There was recognition among planners that the interface between deliveries, that the fratricide was likely to ensue.
That we'd be killing our own forces, not just enemy forces. And yet the Air Force and the Navy did not have a capability to disengage their different war plans.
Eisenhower referred to the lack of integration as a monstrosity.
In 1958, General Nathan Twining, Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff, had proposed improving the nuclear planning process with a joint unified command. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, vigorously opposed the idea and feared losing control of the Navy's Polaris.
General Twining was certainly well aware that to have an effective integrated plan, that he was going to have to make the Navy comfortable with this process. Twining earlier had pushed for some kind of a structured, coherent planning process.
The compromise, if you will, was that each of the forces would control their own delivery systems, but that targeting had to be combined in a joint staff.
On August 11, 1960, Eisenhower formally approved the proposal for the formation of the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff, the JSTPS, envisioned by General Twining.
The decision was taken late in the Eisenhower administration to create this new body out in Omaha, Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff. The first thing that the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff was going to do was put together a single integrated operational plan.
Single integrated operational plan identifies targets, it allocates weapons to the targets, and it decides on how those weapons are delivered to those targets. The PSYOP is based upon the written guidance that begins with the President and is refined by the Secretary of Defense and then further elaborated upon by the Joint Staff.
This is an extraordinarily elaborate undertaking, and PSYOP 62 was the first attempt to do that in a very compressed time frame. It was an inflexible plan in the sense that it didn't have a lot of options built into it.
PSYOP 62 appeared to have a number of options. I believe it was 14, but there was no difference. All it was how generated the forces were. So as more forces became generated, you had what looked like a different option.
Each option included all countries in the Sino-Soviet bloc, giving the president virtually no capability to differentiate. Eisenhower himself began to doubt the wisdom of having only large-scale nuclear attack options.
Eisenhower's science advisor went out and took a look at PSYOP 62 when it was being put together and came back and said it's too inflexible. And I think Eisenhower would have agreed in that.
I think it's fair to say that when Kennedy came into office, he and many of his senior civilian advisors were quite shocked to find the kind of war plans that they had inherited from the Eisenhower administration. Indeed, Kennedy was given a memorandum in July 1961 from McGeorge Bundy that said, in essence, the current plan calls for shooting off everything we have in one shot, and it is so constructed as to make any more flexible course very difficult.
The history, again, of nuclear weapons has been the ever-elusive effort to give the President of the United States flexibility in a choice about what attack options, what uses of nuclear weapons he could choose in a crisis.
The significance of the relationship between the civilian policy leadership and the military personnel who implemented that policy into the PSYOP is perhaps the most significant story of the period from 1960 to 1990.
Cold War tensions in West Berlin would launch a search for flexible nuclear options by a new administration. A search that would tap many of the strategic theories about nuclear war, which had been percolating at RAND throughout the 1950s.
I think the most serious indictment that I have for this administration is that the relative power of the United States has declined in comparison to the Sino-Soviet bloc. This administration has not met its responsibilities either at home or abroad.
Our task is to rebuild our strength.
I want the people of the world and Mr. Khrushchev to know that a new generation of Americans has taken leadership of this country, and that this free society speaks with power, force, and decision.
In 1960, John Kennedy campaigned on fears of a missile gap with the Soviets, a gap which later turned out to be more symbol than substance.
The Soviets had paltry forces. At one point, they had only 4 ICBMs. That was not enough for a major attack on the United States.
President Eisenhower offered Kennedy or some of his advisors a view of the highly classified information, but Kennedy and his team declined to have any knowledge, official knowledge of this, and when they got in, discovered that the missile gap was in the other direction, that we didn't have a problem in that way.
Kennedy surrounded himself with what the Joint Chiefs would refer to as the whiz kids, and chief among them was his 44-year-old Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara.
McNamara recruited from RAND people like Charles Hitch, who became the chief budget figure at the Defense Department, Alan Enthoven, who had an Office of Systems Analysis, Kaufman himself, who had been at RAND. And these were people who applied quantitative methods to solve some of the problems that McNamara wanted solved. And McNamara was a major supporter of these techniques being applied to military problems.
The connection between RAND and the Kennedy administration worked out very well and was very close.
The whiz kids from RAND had new ideas about nuclear strategy and operations, which were unified by the notion that the president should have choices.
When he was briefed initially about the PSYOP, didn't have any choice at all. Kennedy was so furious about this that he said he'd never sit in on any one of these exercises again, and he made it very clear to McNamara that he wanted choices.
The one thing that shocked me almost more than anything else about the PSYOP plans that I reviewed in March of 1961 at SAC was we essentially blasted our way through Warsaw Pact countries in order to get to the targets of our PSYOP in the Soviet Union. And I remember, I thought, my God, what are we going to do to Poland?
Moreover, there's no differentiation in those attack plans between attacking nuclear targets, conventional military targets, and urban industrial targets.
McNamara was originally promulgating A no cities strategy. Don't go after the cities, go after the forces, and do it in such a way as to limit the amount of damage. And no point killing people just to kill them. That's not the point of this.
The no cities approach was an attempt to pursue some thoughts that some of the RAND experts had brought with them.
The only way I could see that one could use nuclear weapons but still have some kind of control over the way in which the exchange might evolve was by avoiding cities.
We asked SAC to develop greater flexibility in their programs, their plans, to provide withholding capabilities. I thought it was very important to provide other options to the president.
As a review of planning guidance for nuclear weapons got underway in the summer of 1961, McNamara was briefing the president about a new crisis in West Berlin. By July, the NSC was considering a variety of military responses to a renewed blockade of West Berlin, including the use of nuclear weapons in Central Europe.
The world is not deceived by the communist attempt to label Berlin as a hotbed of war. There is peace in Berlin today. The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
One of the most important events was the Soviet attempt to take West Berlin. At the time, of course, West Berlin was isolated from the rest of the NATO, located in East Germany. But about that time, I called the SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander, who was General Norstad, back to Washington. And I said, look, Larry, they did A, we did B, they did C, we did D. How is this thing going to evolve?
The flexible response doctrine began when Kennedy and his advisors recognized the Berlin crisis was dangerous and that the utter lack of flexibility in nuclear war plans made it even more dangerous.
By September 1961, a wall separating West and East Berlin reduced the immediate tensions, but it would stand as an enduring symbol of the Cold War for the next 28 years. After the crisis, McNamara issued his first draft presidential memorandum that provided new guidance for PSYOP 63, which for the first time included a secure reserve force.
What PSYOP 63 was a plan to do was to create lower-level options pre-planned, not to do this thinking on the spot, not to have civilian officials ad-libbing a nuclear war plan.
PSYOP 63 was a plan that included 5 primary attack options, designed to be executed under varying contingencies of preemption or retaliation. The plan allowed for withholding attacks in a number of different ways and focused on the destruction of Soviet forces while maintaining a secure reserve force capable of devastating the Soviet society. PSYOP 63 was the first effort to control the escalation of a nuclear war.
The military tended to object to notions of, let's say, escalation control, withholds, complications to the war plan.
Many military officers, when asked to engage in more limited nuclear options, have withholds to protect Soviet cities in the hope that the Soviet Union would not attack our cities, felt that this was abstract theorizing by American civilians and that they did not want to have any part of it.
Theories of escalation control would also be complicated by rapidly increasing numbers of Soviet strategic nuclear forces capable of inflicting unacceptable damage upon the United States.
So the attempt to avoid that by a publicly discussed policy of limiting damage to each side was considered impractical, and we moved away from it very, very quickly. And we moved away from it to what became known as flexible response.
McNamara shifted from damage limitation to flexible response. A flexible response is basically saying we have to keep our options open. We need what we need to have for lots of different choices, and let's not lock ourselves into one particular kind of strategy, and let's use the minimum force necessary to achieve our goal.
Flexible response, in a sense, was a withholding strategy. We'd only use a portion of our force, hoping that the Soviets would only use a portion of theirs.
Same kind of thing he endorses today, that nuclear weapons should never be used unless the other side uses them first, that we should endorse a no first use policy. The West European allies we had didn't like that at all.
And the Europeans said, well, you're going to fight a conventional war here and destroy Western Europe with non-nuclear munitions, or we are going to be overrun. That does not sound like a very good deterrent. The Europeans preferred to have at least the public discussion emphasizing nuclear weapons.
And NATO policy, in effect, would be supported by increasing the numbers of both strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons.
Today we have a flexible fighting team ready to deal with any threat, whether it be large or small. We are superior to the communists in nuclear power, and we intend to stay that way.
Indeed, there were 7,000 tactical nuclear weapons in Western Europe. McNamara introduced those weapons as a way to reassure the Europeans that he was prepared to use nuclear weapons. I'm not sure that he would ever have used them. That was not his nature, but it was part of a symbol of American support.
Despite my belief, and it was shared by the President Kennedy, that it would be contrary to the interests of the U.S. and NATO to ever initiate the use of nuclear weapons. That was still the publicly stated NATO policy, and it was the policy that underlay NATO's war plans.
Which in some ways is a lot like what was the official policy in the last years of the Eisenhower administration, that we may try to hold you back without using nuclear weapons, but then we may bring nuclear weapons in. It was a policy that was clear as mud, deliberately clear as mud.
In the General Assembly, a vitriolic attack on a Philippine delegate who spoke of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Khrushchev falls to personal insult.
I mean, Khrushchev in this way was like Stalin. He wanted to seem stronger rather than weaker. So this was a pretty high-stakes game of politics. But I think to his mind, nuclear war was just out of the question. So it was this, see who would blink first in a crisis.
Since the heady days of Sputnik, Khrushchev had impressed the West with his claims for Soviet technological prowess. But 5 years later, the Soviet leader grew bolder. In October 1962, the United States had Jupiter missiles on NATO bases in Britain, Italy, and Turkey, and their flight times to targets in the Soviet Union were measured in minutes. In Khrushchev's eyes, the U.S. had altered the strategic balance of power.
One of the explanations for Khrushchev's action in Cuba is to plug the gap in strategic forces by deploying systems that can strike the U.S.
On October 14, a recon plane returns with the first hard photographic evidence indicating the presence of Soviet offensive missiles in Cuba. Immediately, increased surveillance is ordered.
The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba tested U.S. strategic nuclear policy at a time when it possessed an overwhelming nuclear superiority at a ratio of nearly 17-1. Yet the execution of pre-planned nuclear options contained in PSYOP 63 was only remotely considered within EXCOM, the executive committee established by Kennedy to deal with the crisis.
I agreed we had to get them out because they'd been introduced under the cloak of deceit. But I stated, we should be clear on one thing. They did not change the military balance.
While all agreed that action was necessary, there was no consensus about the impact of the missiles in Cuba upon the strategic balance. The Joint Chiefs believed that Soviet missiles 100 miles offshore were massively destabilizing.
All of the West
hemisphere from Hudson Bay to Lima, Peru is within their range. With the facts now before him, President Kennedy continues to meet with his top advisors.
And I said, what the hell difference does it make whether a missile is launched from 100 miles off the shore or 5,000 miles off the shore? Before they put those there, you knew damn well that if we launched a first strike, they would launch whatever survived of their force, and we've all agreed that it would be sufficient to deter us from launching a first strike. So before they put those missiles there, we didn't have a first strike capable. But we did have a clear capability to deter. Now they put those missiles there in Cuba. We still don't have a first strike. It hasn't changed a bit. But we still have a deterrent.
They realized that they were very close to a nuclear war because as they looked at the potential outcomes in the heart of that crisis, they didn't look very good.
The ex-com never really raised the issue of what do we do with our nuclear forces. The only thing that made them think differently was when I pointed out to them that SAC was moving its forces down within range of the Cuban missiles. And at that point, they began to recognize that this was a military as well as a political issue.
During the 5 or 6 days, we debated two major alternatives. One was a quarantine, and the other was an airstrike, which was recognized would have to be followed by a sea and land invasion.
As Kennedy reviewed the options one last time, he asked General Sweeney, the operational commander, if an airstrike would destroy all the missiles.
He said, Mr. President, I can guarantee you we will destroy more of those missiles than any other Air Force could. But can I guarantee you there won't be 1, 2, or 5 left? No. Now, at that moment, it was clear in my mind that Kennedy was not going to support the attack. What president would initiate action that almost surely would result in 1, 2, or 5 nuclear warheads detonating on some of his major cities?
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventuality. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response on the Soviet Union.
I think that ultimately it was the sheer horror to McNamara of contemplating a serious nuclear war that led him to back off to the notion of assured destruction as sufficient to hold the Soviet Union at bay.
Now, this had an immense impact on my thinking about the use of nuclear weapons. I have often said publicly, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the best managed foreign policy or defense policy crisis of the last 50 years. But in the end, we avoided nuclear war by the narrowest of margins because of luck. All of this influenced my thinking regarding nuclear strategy, nuclear force levels, and particularly my advice to President Johnson.
So later on, McNamara began to stress the ultimate deterrent, the assured destruction capability, as not just the minimum deterrent, but as the essence of deterrence, because he wanted that to be a constraining force.
After absorbing a Soviet first strike, a U.S. capability of destroying 25 to 30% of their population and 50% of their industrial and military capability.
Then the technical people said 400 megaton weapons on Russian cities and industrial capacity would do the job. So that from then on was the design goal for building forces, to have 400 weapons assured of delivery despite their destruction before launch, despite their possible attrition in going through defenses.
Peak in 1962, with 283,000 personnel and 3,400 aircraft, SAC exercised considerable influence upon decisions about nuclear force requirements. McNamara's initial guidance, supporting a policy of flexible response, had prompted the JSTPS to identify many more military targets.
Flexible response was driving the inventory. If you wanted to have flexible response, you wanted to have a large number of weapons, you wanted to develop new kinds of weapons.
The Air Force immediately not only rejoiced, but saw the opportunity to expand their capabilities, especially the Minuteman ICBM, and they proposed buying 10,000.
McNamara, increasingly during his tenure in the Pentagon, became consumed with trying to put a lid on the nuclear forces.
For McNamara, assured destruction became a rationale for sizing retaliatory forces of the PSYOP, as well as a declaratory policy of deterrence.
McNamara believed that he would be deterred by the threat of massive retaliation, and he assumed that the Russians would feel the same.
But I think that was a grave misunderstanding of how the Soviet leaders thought about nuclear weapons, and especially about the way in which the military thought about nuclear weapons, which was in terms of fighting a war, and, because that was, in a way, their mission.
They tend to be very tough-minded about these things. They're always interested in much more force than they might ever need. They're very conservative that way. That's their whole history.
And I think that there was a substantial period of time when the Soviet Union built strategic forces for reasons that had to do with internal Soviet politics and internal resource allocations. Nuclear theory and nuclear strategy has made a lot of difference in the way we pointed weapons, but it has not made nearly as much difference as we like to claim in how many weapons we had. And I believe that is almost certainly true for the Soviet Union. Said, when we build, they build, and when we stop, they build.